I want you to imagine what's happening inside Rolf's mind at the moment. Rolf's brain is a fantastic machine. Anything that's capable of writing a 2 million copy bestseller is a fantastic machine. But it has more neurons in it, more cells in it than there are people on planet Earth. And each of them is very precisely connected with the other ones in exactly the right way. And at the moment, he's laying down a new memory in that brain. And he's doing it by switching genes on and off in some of those neurons so that the synapses between those neurons change in strength and frequency and shape. And that's happening in real time as we speak. And it's the product of thousands of different moving parts within each of those billions of neurons. The ribosomes, the genes, the proteins, the synapses, these are all changing in real time so that he can have a memory of me making this speech about him. And that machine is so exquisitely complicated and beautifully designed that it's almost impossible to believe that it wasn't designed by a designer. But around 200 years ago, we began to get used to the idea that it wasn't designed by a designer, that it came about through a bottom-up process of emergence, through descent with modification, through trial and error, through natural selection. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace gave us this idea in a convincing way, and most of us have been able to accept that in the last 150 years. Not all. I can hear some muttering. But I think we've hardly started to take this idea on board. Because I think there are lots of other things in this world that came about in a similar way, and we're still making the same creationist mistake about other things that we made about genetic and biological systems before. We're still being creationists, if you like, and particularly when we come to human society. And we need to understand much more how such human society evolves, the technology in it, the rules and the tools and the way we organize society is much more evolutionary and much less planned and designed than we are used to thinking. Around 1767, nearly 250 years ago, a Scottish philosopher by the name of Adam Ferguson wrote something which I think is rather profound. He said, "There are objects in the world that are the results of human action, but not the execution of any human design." And what he meant by that was things like the English language, or if you like, the German and French language, things of great complexity that are not natural phenomena like thunderstorms. They're clearly man-made, and yet no one made them. No one designed them. The English language emerged through a process of incremental trial and error, through a process of recombination between its parts, just in the same way that genetic recombination results in evolution. It emerged through trial and error. It came about through descent with modification. It was incremental, and it was spontaneous. It produced a machine of great complexity with thousands of moving parts we call words, all linked together with rules that we obey slavishly as if they were the law of the land. And we do this even though there's no police force to tell us to do it, there's no government to tell us to do it, there's no central planner to tell us to do it, there's no chief executive of the English language. It's an emergent phenomenon. And in most of our lifetimes, we've seen another of these phenomena emerge called the internet. And the internet emerged through peer-to-peer interaction among people as soon as computers could communicate with each other in a way that was utterly spontaneous. And sure, you needed great inventions like packet switching to make it possible, but basically it happened in a spontaneous way, and none of us knew how it was going to happen or why it was going to happen, and yet it has order, it has complexity, it has a fit between form and function. And what is true of languages and the internet is also true of almost everything else in our society too. Morality changes over time. We become much more tolerant of things like homosexuality, less tolerant of things like paedophilia. That's not because somebody tells us to think that way, but because we evolve changing habits in our morality. Adam Smith made this point 200 years ago at morality. He wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he argued that our morality is not taught to us by priests, but is something we negotiate among ourselves as we grow up. and that you kind of work out from people's reactions to your behavior what is moral and what is not moral in your society. In some societies, taking revenge by killing someone is a moral thing to do. In others, it's an immoral thing to do. And you kind of work that out as you grow up, and that's how you decide what the moral code is in society, and priests just reflect it back to you after you've kind of worked it out for yourself. That was Adam Smith's rather atheistic argument in the 18th century. And the same is true of the common law, for example. The common law is an evolutionary system that arises by trial and error. Good ideas in the law catch on, bad ideas are rejected. And the same is true of government. Government starts out always and everywhere as a protection racket. One strong guy saying, I'm going to have a monopoly on violence and I'm going to suppress all other violence. That's how government starts. That's what government is originally. But it turns into something much more sophisticated, much bigger, much more benign, but it takes a long time, and it does so gradually and by a form of trial and error. You can see government emerging, by the way, in prisons today, because in large prisons you get gangs that gradually take over the governance within the prison and gradually suppress other forms of violence. It's a very parallel phenomenon to what has happened in tribal societies hundreds of years ago. The same is true of money, which has evolved from cowrie shells to electronic bits to bitcoins to things like that by a process of gradual change and accumulating difference. But I think where it's clearest, this, is in the evolution of technology. Technology changes by a process that looks awfully like evolution. And there's an incremental, inevitable, inexorable nature to this. And one of the ways this expresses itself is in the phenomenon of simultaneous invention. Who invented the light bulb? That absolute emblem of brilliant ideas, the light bulb. You know, it's the sort of metaphor for a great invention. Thomas Edison, right? No, I come from Northern England. It was Joseph Swan. But if you come from France, it's Maxime. And if you come from Russia, it's Lodygin. And you're all right. There were 23 people who came up with roughly the same design of the light bulb in the same decade independently in the 1870s. And they were all stumbled on the same idea. The idea was ripe. The technology was ready to go. The component parts, glass, electricity, vacuum, filaments, they were all ready to be combined. It was inevitable that someone was going to do it in that decade. You could run all of them over with a tram and you'd still have light bulbs at the end of that process. Just as you could have run Sergey Brin and Larry Page over in 1990 with a bus, and we would still have search engines today. There is a dispensability about inventors. This is true of every invention you look at. If you go back and look at it, you find there was always a rival who's furious that he didn't get the credit. And he's probably right. I mean, look at Newton and Leibniz, who had a feud for about the rest of their lives about who had invented calculus, because they'd both come up with it independently. Or Darwin and Wallace. Even Einstein, who genuinely did get to special relativity alone. If you go back and look at Hendrik Lorentz's notebooks, you'll find that he was going to get there very soon if Einstein didn't. So this phenomenon of simultaneous invention tells us that technology is marching to its own tune and picking inventors along the way, and there's very little we can do about it, and that there's something inevitable about the fact that in this day and age, a drone costume designer will come into existence because it's necessary that we need such a person. So Moore's law kind of tells you the same thing. If you look at the improvement in the cost of computing over the last 50 or 60 years, you find it's followed this strangely regular trajectory. Even though we discovered the Moore's law, Gordon Moore discovered it in the early 1960s, we still haven't been able to cheat it. We still haven't been able to jump ahead. Why not? We need to do the incremental steps to get there. There's something very inexorable about technology. You can't stop it, you can't speed it up. It marches to its own tune. And This is not to be rude about inventors and discoverers. Of course, they're brilliant people. And in fact, in one way, it's a credit to them because they have to get there first, whereas Mozart didn't have to get to his concertos before someone else. You know, unlike artists, scientists are in a race with each other and technologists. Now, I think when you think these ideas through hard enough, you get to see society in a much more bottom-up way. And you start to notice that who wins wars or who wins elections tends to be much more of a bottom-up thing, much more dependent on what's going on in society at a time than on what one particular individual did in a campaign, whether a military one or a political one. In other words, in the great man theory of history argument, I come down against great men. I think their role is exaggerated. This was a theme of the French Enlightenment. Diderot, in particular, made the point that we are exaggerating the role of great men, of generals and kings and priests. They get too much credit and they don't deserve so much. And so in the Great Encyclopedia, if you wanted to read a biography of Newton, which was his great hero, you had to look it up under the W for Woolstrop, which is the village where Newton was born in England. It's a kind of joke in the 18th century about how these people don't matter as much as they think. Now, of course, great men can take history by the scruff of the neck and change it. But as Lord Acton said, great men are often bad men. And actually, to achieve good things, it's much easier to see them emerge gradually from below. This idea goes back to the 18th century particularly. It's the central theme of the Scottish and French Enlightenment of the 18th century. But it goes back much further too. And if there is a great man, I think it's Lucretius, the Roman poet in the 1st century BC, who wrote De Rerum Natura, On the Nature of Things, a wonderful poem. He died in mid-stanza, which we don't know why, but the poem is unfinished. And he made the argument that there are no gods, that the world is just something that emerges through the interactions of individual people, and there's a hugely spontaneous order in the world. And this poem was not to the taste of the Christian church. So it rooted out every copy and burnt it as soon as it could. And the poem was lost for 1,400 years and rediscovered in a monastery in Germany in 1417. And it became a real manifesto of the 18th century Enlightenment in particular. People like Spinoza, Voltaire, but also Thomas Jefferson had 5 copies, 5 different translations of it in his library. It's a great idea and one we need to take much more seriously. And it leads me to the slightly weird conclusion that the good things that happen in the world, like the Industrial Revolution, let's call it the Industrial Evolution, because that's what it was, and the great enrichment of the last 50 years, the incredible decline in poverty that we've seen in recent years. In my lifetime, we've gone from roughly 3/4 of the world living on less than $2 a day to less than 10% of the world living on $2 a day, corrected for inflation. That most of these things happen gradually, incrementally, and unplanned, and that the horrible things happen suddenly and planned, like somebody starts a war, or there's a terrorist incident or something like that. So I just want to speak up for the gradual, unplanned, emergent nature of the world. And what this, of course, means is that it's still happening. We're heading into the future with these sort of evolutionary systems. The world is going to change whether we like it or not. It's going to bubble up from the way we interact. Look at what's happening on social media today, for example. And I haven't the foggiest idea where it's going, nor does anyone else, particularly if they're an expert. Philip Tetlock is quite right. You know, a bunch of chimpanzees throwing darts at a dartboard is better than experts on the whole at telling you what's going to happen in the future. Nonetheless, just take one technology that's emerging today, blockchain, the technology behind Bitcoin, and think about it for a second. It's a technology which threatens to disintermediate all sorts of things by making smart contracts so that we can effectively deal with each other without third parties to verify that we've got the money or whatever it is, the property that we need, to do without lawyers and accountants, essentially. And if that were to happen, it could have a huge effect. Companies like Ethereum are exploring this idea. It may go nowhere, or it may be a very exciting new development. What's beautiful about it, though, is that we don't know who started it. He's called Satoshi Nakamoto, but he's not Japanese. He uses a German web address, but he's not based in Europe. He works East Coast hours, but he's not North American. Well, he may be North American, but he's not East Coast. There's an Australian who claims to be him, but most of us don't believe it's him. It's rather wonderful, I think. And it's a good metaphor for how we should see innovation as something that emerges from the way people react and that doesn't have to have a demigod in charge of it. Look at the way the West Coast industries that dominate the digital economy put people on pedestals as if they were great gods with names like Zuckerberg and Bezos and Jobs. You know, these aren't gods, these are great people, but they emerged from within this organization. So I'm just going to end by saying, here is a tribute to all the ordinary people who make the world such an exciting place, rather than the people who take the credit from above. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Rob.
This was brilliant. You just trampled on the soul or the egos of a lot of people in this room.
Yeah.
A lot of big men, big women we have here. We have Nobel Prize winners. We have 100 CEOs in here. We have heads of states, ambassadors. You just trampled on these guys. Don't you think if, also, there are also young people who said, I want to change the world. What would you say to them? Just wait, somebody else will do it? Just relax?
No, but don't be too utopian about it. Don't be too big man about it or big woman about it. Change the world, yes, but through the way you behave, through what you do, not through telling other people how to do it. I think that's probably the message. But sure, yeah, and I've gone a little bit too far. People, individuals...
They're going to lynch you out there.
Individuals do matter, but I just think we err on the side of thinking they matter more than they do.
Yeah. You made the difference between science and the arts. So if, Greta Patzke is not going to achieve artificial photosynthesis, eventually somebody will. It doesn't matter, which name is going to be put on that invention. Somebody's going to do it. But without Beethoven, we wouldn't have those 9 symphonies in 10,000 years. Are you sure? Isn't there also some sort of a time that's right for that type of symphony, or a type that's right for Hamlet, and we don't have to wait for Shakespeare? Somebody else might come with a similar plot at the same time?
Actually, I think you're right that the English language had reached a fertile stage by the late 16th century that it was bound to throw up some really great literature. And look at all the other poets. Look at Marlowe and Johnson. There was a fantastic flowering of literature at that period. Likewise, instruments and orchestral instruments had reached the stage where classical music in some form would have emerged, whether it's Mozart or Shakespeare or Beethoven or Schubert. But the particular works they produced, of course, are unique, and that's the difference. Francis Crick once said, I wrote his biography, and he once said that if Jim Watson had been killed by a tennis ball before we discovered the double helix, because Jim used to go off and play tennis a lot, I don't think I would have discovered the double helix, but I know someone else would have very quickly. And we actually know that, Maurice Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin and people were ready to do so. And I think that is quite an interesting difference between art and science.
Mm-hmm. Do you think in the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, the top-down forces have increased or have they become weaker? I'm looking at China, maybe now Trump.
Well, I think there's been too many attempts at top-down. I think the euro is an overreaching of top-downery, if you like. But I think 2016 is going to go down as a year of bottom-up, isn't it? I mean, Italy, Brexit, Colombia, Trump, you know, etc. These are populist rebellions. Not all pretty ones, I admit, but ones that kind of show a rebellion against top-downery. Mm-hmm.